On February 5th, in an open letter, 100 European economists led by Thomas Piketty demanded that the debt held by the ECB be cancelled. A few days later, Christine Lagarde, governor of the ECB, the European Central Bank, stated that there was no possibility of this. As a result, all the European media are beginning to question the interest of cancelling the debt held by the ECB without asking whether this question has only one meaning. And yes, as they all agree to explain that the debt held by the ECB is a debt that one owes to oneself, has anyone ever wondered if it is really a problem? Then, in the second part of this collective demand for debt cancellation, our economists call for spending an amount equivalent to this debt cancellation to invest in a new economic and ecological deal. To the torturous aspect of this reasoning that tells us to get out of debt, to get into debt immediately afterwards, where will this money come from to invest in ecology and I don't know what else? Are we going to get into debt with the ECB, on the markets, with our population or foreign investors? All this is not the same, and not everything is worth it. Come on, let's go. Since it's a question of erasing debts held by the European Central Bank, let's look precisely at what we're talking about. First of all, it should be remembered that the ECB is only a subsidiary of the national central banks held pro rata by each central bank according to its weight in Europe. It is indeed the governing council of the national central banks that runs the ECB and not the ECB that runs the governing council. By virtue of this, when the ECB buys French debt, for example, it is the Bank of France that holds this debt in its accounts. The ECB has no account of its own. The accounts of the ECB are only a consolidation of the accounts of the national central banks. In other words, it is indeed France that buys France's debt through a collective decision of all the national central banks in Europe. To put it simply, the ECB is merely a place where the decisions of the governing council are recorded. So, we can summarize the situation differently. The Bank of France printed money to finance the French government's indebtedness during the crisis of the anti-COVID measures with the agreement of the other national central banks that are part of the Euro system. Another interesting thing is that, since the Bank of France is a French authority, all the interest it collects on debts it holds is revenue for its institution. As a result, at the end of the year, this interest is part of the national accounts. When the French government pays 10 billion euros in interest to the Bank of France, France's wealth has not moved an inch since it is money that has gone from the left pocket to the right pocket. So our most brilliant economists are splitting hairs for something that has absolutely no impact on public finances. This is a completely irrelevant issue, zero, nil, nada. At that point, you're going to stop me right away and say, but Richard, it's still debt, and a debt has to be repaid. And then you unknowingly make Lagardism. You think that it is of any interest to take 500 billion out of the accounts of a French administration and put it into another administration that is just as French? And there I hear you thinking the following. But you're telling us that debt doesn't exist then? That it has no impact? Well, no. The debts are always paid. On the other hand, depending on their nature, they are paid either at the moment they are created, which is the case of the government's indebtedness to itself, or at the moment they are repaid. I've already explained this for Japan, but I can do the same for France since this debt story is an act of Japanization in a way. Let's start with the simplest. France borrows 50 billion from the USA. France therefore immediately has 50 billion more purchasing power that it will be able to use. Then, when the loan is repaid, France will be 50 billion poorer. Let's leave aside the interest, which is yet another problem, and at the moment it is at zero. In this case, everyone understands. On the other hand, when France prints 50 billion for itself, it's different because the 50 billion comes immediately from the pockets of the French. When you print this money, nothing happens. On the other hand, as you distribute it, you're going to degrade the value of the money already in the country. Since there is more money and as many goods and services available, the money in circulation is worth less in proportion to the quantity you inject. In fact, the value of the euro and the dollar is declining against countries that have not printed their debt, like China. This is not a coincidence, and it is not over. So when you print your own money, you pay the cost of the debt when you use it. The Keynesians, or at least those who claim to be Keynesians, to justify having more money at their disposal to exercise their political power, claim that if the government makes the right collective choices, then the country will be richer at the end of the operation because the strategic government will have saved the fire chestnuts by its clairvoyance. I will say that in France, we make rescue plans and other big loans every 5 years, and, to my knowledge, France has a tendency to go down in the ranking of rich countries rather than up. On the other hand, people with liberal thinking will tell you that any massive printing of the government for its own use leads to misallocation of resources because there's nothing harder than knowing what to do in the future. This leads to distortions in the economy at all levels and ultimately to widespread impoverishment. My personal view is that asking politicians and officials have never exercised responsibility by taking personal risks to strategize is not a brilliant idea. As Nassim Taleb would say, these people don't gamble their skin, so they are pretty serene when it comes to making decisions for which they will never assume any negative consequences. To finish with this debt story, repaying the debt of the Bank of France is like taking money out of the system. Theoretically, this may seem clever, but in reality, it's just the opposite because it would be a bit like throwing salt in the water and then wondering how we're going to recover it because the pasta is too salty. Let me explain. In the case of the anti-COVID crisis in March, when you print to give money to all those who are unemployed and to companies so as not to go bankrupt, you raise a tax on the entire French population because it is the value of the currency that is falling. Then when you want to withdraw this money, you're going to have to tax, cut expenses, or whatever. So you're going to take in very specific places and you're going to create imbalances again because you thought you were smarter than everyone else. That's what the economist Hayek called the fatal presumption. In other words, when you've made a mistake, it's not by making a second one over it that the first one will have disappeared. On the other hand, if you erase the debt in the accounts of your national bank, you accept the idea that the shot has been fired and that it's better to take your losses than to lock yourself up a little bit more. Error is human, but persevering in error is diabolical, as a Roman saying goes. Finally, if you decide to leave this debt in the accounts without touching it, the famous perpetual debt, whether or not interest has been paid, it is strictly the same. This will have no impact on the level of poverty in France. Then what about Thomas Piketty's idea? And I quote, to offer the European governments the means for their ecological reconstruction, but also to repair the social, economic, and cultural damage. Already, we now know that the policies that would make this decision will offer nothing at all. To do this is simply to make more debts. This is another subject completely disconnected from the first. As for whether it would be smart to print 600 billion and then have it distributed haphazardly by people who have proven that they don't understand anything about what they're doing, I think you've understood what I think. Before we fix anything, the first step is to understand how it works. If you know what I mean.
Thank you so much for watching. If you like my videos, please subscribe and don't forget to hit the bell if you want to be notified of the next episode. And if you want to invest in the stock market over the long term or diversify your financial portfolio, I'm offering you an analysis of the 8 European star stocks to have. Thanks again for watching and have a great day.